Okay, folks, back with you here 5 minutes after the hour, 5 o'clock. I said some dangerous music in the background. Makes you feel like we're creeping up on you there a little bit. This is the Nick Taliaferro Show, WURD. AM 900 is where your dial is set. We hope you keep it there all day long. We like to talk to you, and we like to hear from you as well. Phone lines are open to you at 215-634-8065. 215-634-8065. Outside of the Philadelphia listening area, you can make an absolutely free call by dialing 866-361-0900. That is 866-361-0900. Coming along in just about another half hour, we will be entertaining the presence of a scholar of the First Order, Dr. Neal A, who is the Vice President of the Department of Humanities over at Arizona State University, where he's also a professor of English, and he teaches a class called the N-Word, the anatomy of a word. The N-Word, rather, an anatomy lesson, rather. I got that a little bit wrong. In the news, ladies and gentlemen, a word has been catapulted into our consciousness once again, a word that truly had never really gone away. The movie Django has once again brought us face to face with a word that became absolutely villainized and then almost iconically villainized during the O.J. Simpson trial. After that, it was apotheosized by hip-hop artists all over the country as they used this word again and again. And now it has been anonymized, if I can coin that word, as we no longer even mention its name. We just simply refer to it as the N-word. I thought it was time for us to have a true academic discussion about it. And a little over a week ago, I let you hear just the briefest of conversation with our guest this afternoon, who will help us to kind of take a new look at this word in the zeitgeist of American culture. He teaches a class called the N-Word, an anatomy lesson, and serves as the Associate Vice President for Humanities and Arts at Arizona State University. Please make welcome to WURD's airwaves, Dr. Neal A. Dr. Lester, thank you so much for consenting to be with us, especially after my long and lengthy illness.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad that you're better. I'm excited to be engaging in the conversation again.
Well, no, it's a pleasure to have you on board. People have been waiting and asking me. You know, it's funny, Dr. Lester. People called when I was out, and I thought they would call to ask how I was doing. They would say, when are you going to have Dr. Lester on? I said, thank you for asking about my health. So this is obviously an important...
that means that you're that people are waiting for something. So you're
yes.
part of that something. So thank you for having the courage and, shall I say, the audacity to have us have this conversation, because this is not a conversation that we often have in ways that probe beneath the surface.
Well, in a state like Arizona, where there is, some people say that xenophobia is starting to raise its head more than just a little, to teach a class called the N-Word, an anatomy lesson, is a bold and audacious thing to do as well. What occasioned your desire to teach this, and how difficult was it to make it a part of your curriculum?
Right. Well, it was less a desire than a need. And I think any time that one teaches about difference in a state like Arizona that fought against having the King holiday, that is certainly in the news now for many reasons, not the least of which has to do with attacks, real and perceived, on difference, whether it be brown black people or brown Latino people, and also attacks on ethnic studies. It becomes bold and audacious. But I was hired to do this, so in many ways, this is my job. Now I try to bring to the job a certain probing that allows me to learn as much about my subject. So this was not something that I approached with a certain sort of expertise, but rather a curiosity and a need based on some of what I witnessed just before the 2008 presidential election here. And that sort of occasioned my desire to look into what was going on, why was the word resurfacing, and what exactly had we gleaned from all these NAACP efforts to erase, redefine, and bury the word. And I was actually quite surprised that nobody was sort of looking at this word beyond, say, whether or not, people should read it in Huckleberry Finn, for example.
Well, I was wondering, Dr. Lester, when, because everybody will talk about black people and everybody will talk about people of color and everybody will talk about African Americans. But when you use the word, and I shall dare to utter its name now, but when you use the word nigger, people suddenly become apoplectic on both sides of the racial divide. What causes this great disturbance in the force just by the mere uttering of a word?
Well, it's a word like no other word, and part of that is the history that's associated with the word and also the present history that continues to be associated with the word. It is a word that, although it may not have started as a word that was disparaging, it was nevertheless a word that dealt with difference, even as early as the 16th century. Difference easily becomes attached to value and judgment. And so it didn't take very long before the word itself became extremely disparaging as it described those of African descent. So while it was a word that derives from the Spanish word that means black, negro, all kinds of pronunciations and spellings evolved into something that was consistently disparaging until this alleged, taking it back by hip-hop culture.
I see. Well, I mean, let's delve a little deeper into the etymology of the word, Dr. Lester. It comes from, everyone is familiar with the word negro and the Latino words and derivatives of that word that simply mean darkness or blackness.
Right.
But the word Nigger, how did it come to mean something so reprehensible and so vile? And then at the same time, something that is so endearing and affectionate that our young hip-hop artists throw it around as though it were the national anthem.
Right. Well, I'm still trying to figure out how it has become so endearing, so I suspect that some of our listeners will school me on that. What I can say is that pronunciation and spelling have always been sort of intermixed in this conversation, and part of that, it depends on where you are in the country, how things sound and how they are received and perceived. So the word itself, I mean, we knew that it describes something, but rarely are people described without some inherent connection that marks difference. So I am who I am because I'm not you. You are you because you're not me.
Right.
So while this may be something that describes color, when one talks about color in the context of an individual, of a human being, then it took on these kinds of disparaging connotations and denotations, because black and dark was synonymous with evil and undesirable and barbaric and all those other kinds of things we've come to know from those exercises where one looked in a thesaurus and a dictionary.
Right.
Malcolm X talks about that. Ossie Davis talks about that. So the very nature of the English language fed into some of how we have perceived that. Now, what I'm trying to figure out is at what point was there demarcation between the disparaging, the intimidation, the violence that was very distinctly racialized, and this sense that we've taken it back. And that's what part of my research tries to do. When I teach this class, it's not about convincing people whether or not they can use it. We live in a place where you can basically say what you want. My class is about, once you know the history, you know a little bit more about the nuances and the textures of the word, does one choose to use the word? So this is about choice, not about unawareness.
We're speaking with Dr. Neal Lester, who teaches a class at the University of Arizona State University, rather, entitled "The N-Word: An Anatomy Lesson." And I understood originally that the reason why you advertised it as such is that you knew that if you spelled the word out, then you would not be able to have that class. Let me ask this question. In the class, when you are in dialogue with your students, and I am assuming that they're not all people of color nor all African American, do you continually use the euphemism, the N-word, or does the word itself take on its own color, weight, and light?
Well, that's interesting, because I didn't necessarily not call the course quote unquote nigger an anatomy lesson. But what I recognized was the potential to subvert my very best educational efforts by posting something that I know could be taken out of context. So there was a deliberate effort to think about that in the same way that when I taught a class on blacks in film, I had to think about whether or not I wanted to use minstrel images on the poster.
I see.
Because anybody can sort of take those if they're posted around a building and sort of make that into something else. And once we got into the classroom, then that became an issue where we could talk face-to-face about building trust, about building a community, and basically recognizing that we would take the materials in that class and use those for the purpose that the materials were being given to the students and that I was creating. So this was not a class you take the stuff out and then you present it in a dorm. The next thing you know, you're presenting it to the newspaper out of the context of trying to be an educational experience. So there was an element of trust. I had to recognize that I had to go with what felt right in terms of talking about it. If I'm quoting a last poet's poem, I resorted a lot to listening. So I wouldn't necessarily have to read Richard Pryor because we talk about the use of the word in language, or Paul Mooney. I'd bring the recordings of them in. I would bring in, for example, Dr. Laura's phone conversation with one of her callers. So I didn't necessarily have to repeat the word because it's not part of my personal vocabulary.
Okay.
But I also had to not pass judgment on students who did use it, and it led to a certain kind of honesty. I think whenever you deal with something like this, there's a lot of risk-taking. But then I think in education generally, in order for people to have some moment of discovery, there has to be some level of risk-taking. So it was a risk, and it continues to be a risk.
This is your fourth class that you are teaching?
This will be the first time. This will be the fourth time this fall that I have taught this class to different students, and this is not a required course, so that's very important. I have taught classes that were required for diversity credit, and I know what it's like to meet students who don't want to be there except that they're getting credit for it. So it does help to have students who self-select and students who already come in with at least some openness to hearing about and not feeling, particularly in the case of the white students, that they're under attack.
Well, let me ask the question. It's a twofold question. Sure. What is the normal composition of your class? And what are students who might happen to be white, what are they looking for when they come to a class like this?
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, my classes are probably, 80% non-students of color, and that's not unusual at a very large institution here in the Southwest. And they are mostly female, so that adds an interesting perspective. But I also have, a couple of community folks who are of color who sit in on the class and add different perspectives. I had a staff member sit in, an African-American woman who was significantly older than the students, so she was able to bring a certain perspective there, too. In terms of why the students take the class, they often say in their evaluations and sometimes in the class discussions, family members use this all the time, and I never quite know how to respond to this. And, when I say something to them about using the word, they will say, well, hip-hop uses it all the time. And what they were looking for in the class, at least some of them, was what kinds of ways could they then address those folks who say this is just a word, or we've passed all of those moments where the word was somehow synonymous with slavery. But I think these are students who, if they're self-selecting to take this class, then there's a certain kind of something that they already bring to the class. And sometimes there's some confessional stuff. They're telling me stuff that I would never know. I'd never know that their uncles or aunts use this word all the time, and they felt uncomfortable but didn't quite know how to talk about it. They also shared with me how when they talked to their peers about taking the class, that they then had to somehow defend why they were taking the class.
I can only imagine. Even though I've talked to you and I've done the research on this, I still find it to be almost an Alice in Wonderland going through the looking glass experience. Trying to figure out how this word has become so powerful that we dare not mention its name.
But we do mention the name, and in fact, some people sing the name. If you're singing Jay-Z and Tupac and some of the others, so the name is mentioned. I guess what seemed to come out over and over again in the class discussions is that a word is never about a word. It's never about the letters that make up the word, although some would argue, if you spell it this way, if you spell it that way, it means different things. I'm not quite sure that I buy that.
N-I-G-G-A means affectionate, N-I-G-G-E.
Or the A,
yeah.
And if you don't listen to it carefully, you may not know how it's spelled. And that assumes that, these things aren't written, because if they're written, that takes on a whole level of performance. But the class is not about a word. The class is about the context that has created the word and that sustains the word. The class is about identity. The class is about performance. If this is written, is that different than saying it? And who's saying it? And out of whose mouth is this coming? I think I referenced in our earlier conversation that The View, the talk show with the women, Barbara Walters and Whoopi Goldberg, they had an interesting discussion about this, and I think at the time it was about Perry and his niggerhead campsite that he went to.
Okay.
And there was something about Whoopi saying it as a black woman that, of course, it was beeped out on the network, but then Barbara said it because Whoopi said it. And then Sherry Shepard just explained that just when you said this, Barbara, something went all over me. I can't even explain.
I remember that show.
So that's the essence of this. Is I don't know that there's another word that reaches that sort of visceral level where logic just goes out the window. If it's associated with violence, if it's associated with intimidation, if it has a race specificity attached to it, then I'm not quite sure that we can somehow rationalize, well, if you're offended by this, you shouldn't be. And that's what the class tries to look at in the context of language and identity. And if you write it on the board, such as the middle school guy did in Florida, change, when President Obama was running the first time, his change became an acronym for come help a nigger get elected.
I remember that.
He didn't say it. He wrote it on the board.
Right. I remember that.
But that to me is comparable to, having that word written on my office door or on my car when I go out to the parking lot. And I'm wondering if people would feel as affectionate if that were keyed into your car with the A spelling or the AH spelling, that you'd feel any better about that somehow somebody was talking about that as a term of endearment.
We're speaking with Dr. Neal Lester, who is teaching a class on a regular basis, at least for 4 years now, called The N-Word, an anatomy lesson. He serves as the Associate Vice President for Humanities and Arts and also as a professor of English. And we're having an academic, intellectual discussion of this word that has assumed such proportions, especially with the recent airing of the movie Django. It is a part of the discussion, but it is discussed in darkened corners and shadows and whispered tones, and today we're doing it on air. We will invite you to join this discussion by dialing 215-634-8065 here in the city of Philadelphia. That's 215-634-8065. If you happen to be outside of the city limits and you'd like to join us, you can do so by dialing toll-free at 866-361-0900. That is 866-361-0900. 0900. We'll take your calls as you present them. Dr. Lester, the word itself, I know it's referred to as the N-word, but do you think that we do a disservice to ourselves by continually citing it as the N-word rather than giving it the full force of its meaning by saying the word?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it communicates what it needs to communicate in various contexts. And let me put it this way. The first piece that I published on this actually had to do with an episode in Brooklyn, New York in the early 90s where a young African-American sister and brother had been beat up by a white mob and spray-painted white. And that episode was referred to variously in the media, newspapers, as, they were baptized in a racial epithet, or they would spell the N and then use these asterisks for the rest of the letters.
Right.
Or they would use underlining. And I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. And so I probed a little bit more. I'm not a journalist, but I found out that it depends on the purpose and it depends on the audience as to whether or not media folks would use it. And in the case of that particular episode, I was also struck by the fact that a teaching tolerance animated video had been made from the Southern Law Poverty Center in Montgomery, and that the word had been used as a way, again, of teaching tolerance. Well, when a picture book was made with the author whose work I had studied from the 1980s, Ntozake Shange,
yes,
it was odd to me. I mean, she's never held anything back relative to language. And so I was surprised that in this picture book format that the word nigger was changed to mud people. And that's when I started looking at this thing, okay, well, what if picture books about the civil rights or picture books about slaves somehow euphemize the word? Does that sanitize an experience? And what I ended up saying in that piece is that I don't necessarily believe we should airbrush an experience, particularly if it's historically based. But it's not a word that I use in the same way that I don't use other kinds of words about people or other things. So
it is a profane word to you?
It's not a word that's been part of my vocabulary. If I'm reciting a poem, I can use it. I just used it in the reference of this, but it's not something that I would use in my day-to-day life. It's something that I think about. It wouldn't just flow out of my mouth sort of, without my conscious awareness of it.
Well,
that's what I'm saying.
I'm going to get to our first caller, but we've got enough time to talk a little bit about the editorializing of Mark Twain's work for the purpose of removing the opprobrious nature of the word Nigger. But Ann, you're up first. Our guest today is Dr. Neal Lester from Arizona State University. Welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Ann.
I don't consider myself a nigger or white or black or whatever. I think of myself as a human being. And as a youngster, and I'm an old lady now, but as a youngster, sometimes I did hear that word used affectionately. And then I also heard Caucasian people call people that the word. And but when they called, I heard them call me or anyone else that word, I would say, "Oh, you're a wop, you're a Shanny Irish, you're a."
We got your point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that never bothered me when people use that word, and I did hear it used affectionately and as a derogatory way also.
Let me make sure I understand, Ann, before we go forward. You're saying that you heard it used affectionately even as a child?
Yeah.
Long before the hip-hop culture came and lifted it into the vernacular as a word of affection? You heard it even in your younger days?
Yes.
Wow. Now, Dr. Lester, you hail from Georgia.
Right.
Did you ever hear it used as a term of affection when you were younger?
Well, I never heard it in my environment at all. In fact, the very first time that I remember hearing it was in graduate school, and I was walking from a movie with a white female who happened to be just a friend, and she was called a nigger lover by white males who walked by. He didn't know our relationship. He just, said that because she was with me. So,
right.
I guess the issue in terms of responding to Ann, which is a very, very valid point, and I hear that a lot, is I'm trying to figure out, how this word of endearment and affection was different from the way masters referred to their slaves with affection. And many of them had great affection for their slaves. And so I'm wondering the extent to which, where does that crossover occur, where it becomes this word of affection? And it's very different from, say, that other N word. I mean, the word nappy. I mean, I can see how nappy, nappy hair, nappy, looking back on when I was a nappy-headed boy, I'm not going to be offended by that. I'm offended by that if somebody's talking about my nappy hair outside of my intimate circle. But this word transcends those kinds of ways that we have talked about. And nappy doesn't refer to a person. Nappy becomes an adjective, as opposed to calling somebody a nigger.
Right.
And depending on, in the South, I mean, sometimes Negro was pronounced like nigger, depending on what kind of Southern twang you had with it. So you had to listen very carefully to decide whether or not they were pronouncing it the way it was spelled or how you imagine. And then further complicating that is the word niggardly, which has nothing to do with the context of this word, except that race relations in this country are still so volatile.
I remember when one of the chief mayoral aides was fired because he used the word niggardly at a meeting.
Absolutely. Well, and a student at the University of Wisconsin raised a claim against a professor who had used the word. She went up after class and said, I'm offended by this word. He said, well, that's not what it means. And she said, well, I'm sorry. It sounds so close to that word that I'm offended by it. Could you not use it? And he continued to use it. So do you see? I mean, it's like the joke that Paul Mooney says, oh, people love to say that word Arnold Schwarzenegger because it sounds so close and you can get away with saying it without really saying it.
Ah. Well, Ann, thank you for your call. We appreciate that.
Right.
And the phone lines are still open, 215. We're going to be continuing on all the way until 6:30. And so phone lines are open at 215-634-8065 here in the city of Philadelphia. And for those of you traveling, you give us a call. We'll put you right on to make sure you're not waiting too long. 866-361-0900 is our toll-free line for those of you outside of the city limits. We've got a couple of minutes before we take our break at the top of the hour, Dr. Lester. And I want to ask you, as a professor of English, are you offended by the attempts to whitewash that word from the lexicon of Mark Twain as he writes about the time and the culture that he writes about? Do you think it does violence to the work, and does it neuter the discussion about it?
Well, in that case, I think it's a very odd exercise. I mean, I've always wondered if a teacher, and this is usually at the high school level, if a teacher is somehow reducing that very rich text to the study of a word, then I wonder how that teacher has arrived at that, because there are all kinds of ways that you can talk about that text in really provocative new ways. Mm-hmm. And so I'm also wondering, and I know this happens a lot in high school, and I acknowledge the fact that I don't teach high school, but I'm wondering, about this reading out loud. Are there ways that you can bring in other people reading text so that the students don't feel uncomfortable doing it? But if your conversation about Huckleberry Finn has reduced to a single word, then I wonder if maybe the teacher should sort of open up his or her mind about the other possibilities of that text. To go back to this exercise that was done a few years ago, I think it's really problematic because Negro, nigger, and slave are not synonymous. And that it really does take away a sense of historical authenticity and accuracy when you just sort of change those because it's politically correct to do so.
I'm hearing the conversation becoming almost bifurcated to the point of going in different directions. In one breath, I hear you saying, look, you got to give it its authentic place. But in the other breath, I hear you saying, but this is not a word that I use. And so I'm wondering... Well,
but I'm talking about the difference, though. If it's in literature, that's one thing. If it's in my day-to-day use, then I'm not making a choice about the literature unless I'm writing the literature or teaching the literature. So I'm saying, for example, if that experience that those young kids had in Brooklyn, if that's what they had, is that this white mob just called them this word over and over again, and this teaching tolerance was trying to recreate that in an animation form, then it should be represented as it was. If in the civil rights, when you've got people, little kids trying and adults trying to integrate these segregated spaces, and they were clearly called this, there's no reason to euphemize that. That, however, is different from where we are today, where we're talking about using it affectionately and as terms of endearment.
It gets richer, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be continuing our conversation on the other side of the top of the hour with Dr. Neal Lester from Arizona State University about the N-word. Stay with us. Dr. Lester will talk to you right after we check in with our news.